The barn door shook under a violent kick, dust raining from the rafters. Outside, three horsemen loomed in the fading sun, shadows stretching across the dirt. Silas Granger's voice roared, "Elias Boone, I've come for what's mine, your women and your land." Inside, seven terrified women huddled behind hay bales, milk pails trembling in their hands. Elias gripped his rifle, feeling every heartbeat slam against his ribs. For 3 long years he had hidden from the world, bearing his guilt and grief in lonely silence. But tonight, the world had found him. One choice would decide it all: life, death, and the last chance to protect the only family he had left. Elias Boone had walked away from everything 3 years ago, and some nights he still heard the echo of that decision in his dreams. He could see the lamplight flickering against the rough barn walls, his father's shadow filling the doorway like a storm cloud. The words still hit him as if they were spoken yesterday. "You're no son of mine if you can't carry the Boone name with pride." Elias had slammed the barn door, mounted his horse, and ridden into the darkness, with anger burning in his chest. He thought he was leaving behind pain and shame. Instead, he carried them into the hills like a second skin. The land he chose was lonely, tucked between a ridge of rock and a dry creek bed. He built his fences high and wound barbed wire like a man trying to keep out the world. Rusty locks clung to the barn door, even when there was nothing inside worth stealing. At night, he'd sit by the fire and watch shadows crawl along the walls, his mind replaying the fight with his father in endless loops. He told himself that out here, alone, he was safe. He told himself he didn't need anyone. But isolation is a clever liar. At first it feels like armor, like you finally walled yourself off from hurt, and then slowly it begins to hollow you out. The silence presses in until you can hear your own heartbeat echoing in your ears. The days blur together, and the simple act of speaking another human word feels like lifting a weight you're no longer strong enough to carry. Elias found himself talking to the cows, to the wind that whistled through the grass, and to a one-eyed barn cat he called Rusty. "Morning, old boy," he'd mutter, scratching the cat's ear. But the words felt strange in his mouth, heavy and unfamiliar, like speaking a foreign language he'd once known and now only half remembered. Sometimes he imagined Rusty as the only soul who would keep vigil by his empty chair, if the prairie ever swallowed him like it had other lonely men. The truth Elias never spoke aloud was that he feared that ending. He feared the idea of dying with no one to know, no one to remember him but a barn cat and a few half-starved cows. Yet every time he thought of going back, of facing his family, the weight of pride and guilt kept him rooted. Pride had built his walls. Guilt was the mortar that held them firm. He had chosen silence, and silence was all he had. Out here in the wide, empty land, Elias Boone wore his loneliness like a coat he couldn't take off. It kept him warm enough to survive, but it was slowly, quietly, freezing him from the inside out. Elias Boone was splitting firewood when the world he had spent 3 years avoiding finally found him. His axe rose and fell in a steady rhythm, the thunk of metal on wood echoing across the empty yard. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the dirt, and the wind carried nothing but the dry whisper of sagebrush. Then from far off came the sound of footsteps and the faint metallic clink of a pail. Elias froze, the axe pausing midair. At first he thought he was imagining it. No one came up his path. No one ever did. But as he turned toward the sound, he saw 7 figures slowly emerging from a haze of dust along the road. 7 women walking as if they owned the land beneath their boots. Their worn dresses were streaked with dirt, hems frayed by long travel, and yet there was a determined sharpness in the way they carried themselves. The one at the front drew his attention instantly. Maribel Quinn, though he did not know her name yet, had auburn hair pinned tight and a faded scar running down her cheekbone. A scar that struck a chord somewhere deep in his memory. Behind her, the youngest girl clutched an empty milk pail so tightly her knuckles shone white, while an older woman with silver-streaked hair limped slightly, moving with the careful grace of someone used to pain. They stopped at the edge of his yard, the dust curling around their boots. Elias lowered his axe but did not step forward. His voice came out rough from disuse. "Who are you? What are you doing on my land?" The auburn-haired woman met his eyes without fear. "We're here to milk your cows," she said, as if the words were the most natural thing in the world. Elias blinked, stunned into silence. He looked past her toward the 3 cows grazing in the pasture, their udders heavy and sore. Shame prickled in his chest. He had neglected them, barely managing the work. But anger rose just as quickly. "This is private property," he said. "I don't know what game you're playing, but you need to turn around." The women didn't move. Instead, the silver-haired one took the milk pail from the trembling girl, her hands calloused and confident. "We know what we're doing," she said, her voice firm and seasoned. "Been doing it longer than you've been alive, most likely." Elias felt a strange twist in his chest, a flicker of recognition he couldn't place. Something in their faces tugged at old memories he'd buried deep. He had the sudden, unnerving feeling that these women had been expecting to find him here, that his solitude was not as hidden as he believed. The auburn-haired woman took a step forward. "My name is Maribel," she said, her voice steady as stone. She turned and gestured to the group behind her. "And these women? They're family." Her eyes returned to his, sharp as a blade. "Your family, to be exact." The words hit him like a physical blow. The axe slipped from his hands and thudded into the dirt. For a long moment, the yard was silent except for the faint lowing of the cows. He stared at her, shaking his head slowly. "That's impossible," he whispered. But even as he said it, he started to see it. The familiar slope of a jawline, the stubborn tilt of a chin, the way the youngest girl shifted her weight from foot to foot exactly like his sister Ruth used to when she was nervous. Maribel took another step closer, and in the golden light he saw the scar on her cheek more clearly. She reached up and touched it with her fingertips. "You remember this," she said quietly, "from the hayloft. I was 12. You told me I was too little to play with the big kids. You pushed me away, and I fell." The memory hit him with brutal clarity. He was a boy again, standing in the loft, hearing her cry, then seeing her tumble 15 feet to the packed earth below. She had cried, but she had also laughed through the tears, trying to prove she wasn't afraid. "Maribel," he said, the name tasting strange on his tongue after all these years. "Little Maribel." His gaze shifted to the youngest girl, who now peeked from behind the older women, her hands clutching the pail like armor. Her brown eyes were wide and unblinking, a mirror of someone he once loved more than life itself. His throat tightened. "That girl," his voice cracked. "She's Ruth's?" The girl gave a small nod. "My name's Hope," she whispered. "Mama said you were the best man she knew, even if you left." The words carved into him deeper than any knife. Ruth, his baby sister. The last time he saw her, she was standing in the doorway of their family home, begging him to stay, tears cutting bright tracks down her cheeks. He had ridden away without looking back. And now Ruth was gone, leaving this girl, his niece, to carry her memory. Elias staggered a step backward, the weight of the past crashing down on him. He wanted to ask 100 questions. How did they find him? Why now? What had happened in the years since he turned his back on them? But all he could do was stare as the 7 women fanned out across his yard, moving with the ease of people who had already decided they belonged there. Maribel's voice broke the silence again, softer this time. "We came because Ruth made us promise. She wanted you to know, and she wanted you to choose. Are you going to keep running from your blood, Elias? Or are you going to let us in?" The evening light caught the edge of Hope's eyes, and he saw Ruth staring back at him. His heart, hardened by 3 years of self-imposed exile, gave a painful, reluctant thud. For the first time in years, Elias Boone felt the fragile threads of family pulling at him, refusing to let him drift any farther away. The first sound was a distant thud, so low it blended with the wind. Elias Boone stood in his yard, still reeling from the weight of Maribel's words, when the second sound came clearer. Hoofbeats, steady and deliberate. The women froze, their eyes snapping toward the ridgeline. Dust rose in the last light of evening, curling like smoke against the sky. 3 riders emerged, silhouettes cut against the dying sun. Even from a distance, Elias could see the gleam of metal at their sides and the predatory ease in the way they rode. Silas Granger led them, a bear of a man with a thick beard and eyes like frozen rivers. Stories about him had drifted through the territory for years. a debt collector who preferred blood over coin, a man who poisoned wells and stole land with a smile. The hoofbeats slowed as the riders approached the yard. One of the women, Agnes Doyle, the silver-haired matriarch, leaned toward Elias and whispered, "That's him. He's been hunting us for 2 days. He won't leave without blood or bodies." Elias felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He had spent 3 years hiding from the world, and now the world had come crashing to his doorstep. He walked to the barn door, his boots heavy on the dirt, and reached for the Winchester rifle mounted on the wall. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of the choice he knew was coming. Silas's voice carried across the yard like rolling thunder. "Elias Boone!" he bellowed. "I've come for what's mine. Your women, your land, and anything else I care to take." Elias stepped into the doorway of the barn, rifle resting against his shoulder. He didn't call back immediately. He let the silence stretch, the wind whistling between them. Behind him, the 7 women huddled, Hope clutching her mother's old shawl, her wide eyes fixed on the approaching danger. "This is my land," Elias finally said, his voice hard and level. "And these women are my family. They're not yours to take." Silas laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Family, is it? Funny thing about family. They can't pay debts." He pulled his horse to a slow stop, boots dangling easily in the stirrups. "Ruth Quinn owed me $300 before she died. Medicine cost money. Her life ended, but that debt didn't. And now," he gestured toward the barn, "it falls to them, or to you." Elias's grip tightened on the rifle. He had almost nothing, barely enough to feed himself, let alone buy off a vulture like Silas. The other 2 riders flanked their leader, hands resting casually on the butts of their revolvers, the posture of men who had killed before and would kill again. Inside the barn, the women whispered in fear. Maribel touched Elias's arm, her voice low and urgent. "You can't fight 3 armed men alone. If you try, they'll kill you, and then us." Elias stared at the dust swirling in the golden light. For 3 years, he had sworn off violence. He had left his family because anger had nearly destroyed him. But now, seeing Hope trembling, he felt something primal rising from the pit of his chest. A protective fury he couldn't bury anymore. Silas clicked his tongue and began counting, his voice a mockery of patience. "I'll give you to the count of 10, Boone. Then I come in and take what's mine." The numbers rolled across the yard like hammer blows. 1, 2. Elias positioned himself beside the barn door, rifle ready. He could feel Hope's gaze on his back. 3, 4. He glanced toward Agnes Doyle, and she gave a slight nod. Then, with a practiced movement, she slipped a small Derringer pistol from beneath her skirt. Elias felt a flicker of grim pride. This family had more steel in them than he realized. 5, 6. Silas's voice grew louder. The horses pawed at the dirt, snorting, impatient. Elias could almost feel the pulse of the ground beneath his boots. He drew a deep breath and thought of his sister Ruth, of the night he'd left, of the promise he'd silently made to never let anger rule him again. 7, 8, Maribel whispered behind him. "If we run now, he'll just hunt us down. This is the only chance." 9. The air felt electric, heavy with dust and tension. Elias's finger hovered near the trigger, heart pounding like a drum. 10! The barn door exploded inward under Silas Granger's boot. Splinters flew and a cloud of dust billowed into the fading light. The man filled the doorway, 6.5 feet of muscle and malice, framed by the orange glow of the dying sun. His 2 men followed, guns half raised, grins sharp as knives. "Well, well," Silas sneered. "The hermit does have a little fight in him, but not enough." Elias fired first. The crack of the rifle shattered the air. One of Silas's men cried out and dropped his revolver, blood blooming on his shoulder. In the same instant, Agnes fired her Derringer, the small gun bucking in her weathered hands. The second rider stumbled back, cursing, as a bullet tore through his thigh. Silas lunged sideways, dodging the line of fire, and drew his own revolver. "You're a fool, Boone," he roared. "You can't fight me and win." But Elias didn't feel like a fool. For the first time in years, he felt alive. his purpose as clear as the echo of gunfire in the twilight. He planted his boots in the dirt of his own barn, his rifle steady, and met Silas Granger's cold gaze with the unspoken promise that he would not run again. The barn smelled of gunpowder and dust. Smoke curled through the fading light, catching on floating hay and the jagged edges of shattered wood. Elias Boone stood with his rifle raised, chest heaving, ears ringing from the echo of gunfire. One of Silas Granger's men groaned on the ground, clutching his bleeding shoulder, while the other limped backward toward the barn door, cursing under his breath. Silas himself hadn't moved far. He crouched near the frame of the splintered doorway, revolver in hand, a twisted grin spreading across his scarred face. He looked at Elias with a mix of fury and admiration. "Didn't know you had that in you," he said, his voice low and cold. "But you can't win this. You shoot me, and my men will come for you. They'll come for every last one of these women. You'll all die, and for what? A farm full of dirt and 3 miserable cows?" Elias didn't lower his rifle. Behind him, the Quinn women huddled, silent but fierce. Hope's wide eyes were fixed on her uncle, and Maribel's jaw was tight, the scar on her cheek catching the light. "That's where you're wrong, Granger," Elias said. "This isn't just dirt. This is my family, and this land is soaked with more than blood. It's soaked with memory." Silas snorted. "Pretty words won't pay debt. Your sister owed me $300. Medicine isn't free. That debt falls to you now. Pay up, or I take them." At the mention of Ruth, something shifted in the air. Maribel stepped forward, slowly, carefully, her hands raised to show she carried no weapon. "You want to talk about debt, Silas?" she said, her voice steady. "Then let's talk about how that debt started." Silas's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes flicked to her, and his revolver twitched. "Careful, girl," he said. "Some things are better left unsaid." But Maribel didn't stop. She reached into the folds of her worn dress and drew out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The barn fell silent except for the ragged breathing of the wounded men. She held the bundle up for Elias to see. "These are Ruth's papers," she said softly. "She gave them to me before she died. She wanted you to see them, Elias. She wanted you to know the truth." Elias lowered his rifle just enough to take the bundle with his free hand. His fingers trembled as he unwrapped the oilcloth, revealing a stack of weathered documents. Handwritten notes, land deeds, and crude maps of the surrounding valley. Maribel's voice filled the quiet. "Ruth knew why she got sick. The well on her property didn't turn bad on its own. Someone poisoned it, someone who wanted her land. She started asking questions, and she started writing down everything she found." Elias flipped through the papers, his heart pounding. There were lists of names, dates, and numbers that lined up with the whispered rumors he'd overheard in town years ago. There were sketches of the silver vein running under the Quinn property, and next to it, Ruth had scrawled a single name over and over. Silas Granger. "You killed her," Elias said, his voice raw. "You poisoned her land and bled her dry with medicine she never should have needed." Silas straightened slowly, his grin gone now. "I did what business required," he said flatly. "She wouldn't sell. I made her desperate. That's how this territory works. It's how men like me survive." Elias felt a chill crawl up his spine. In that moment, the anger and guilt he had carried for 3 years crystallized into something sharper than fear. He thought of his sister dying alone in that house, of Hope working herself to the bone, and of his own cowardice hiding in the hills while this man profited from their suffering. "You don't survive off land or cattle," Elias said quietly, lifting his rifle again. "You survive off the pain of people better than you. That ends tonight." Silas hesitated, the first flicker of uncertainty crossing his hard eyes. "You think shooting me fixes anything? I have friends, Boone. Men in every town. You kill me, and they'll be at your door." It was Hope who spoke next, her voice clear and cutting in the heavy air. "Then we show these papers to the marshal, to the church, to anyone who will listen. Mama said sunlight is the only thing men like you can't live under." For a long moment the barn was silent. The wounded man on the floor groaned again, and Silas glanced at him, then at the limp of his other companion. Slowly his grip on the revolver loosened. He glanced back at Elias, a calculation flickering behind his eyes. "You're making a mistake," he said finally. "Men like me, we always come back." Elias took a step closer, his boots scraping the dirt. "Then you better pray you never do, because this time I won't hesitate." Silas's jaw tightened. He holstered his gun and gave a sharp whistle. The limping rider helped the wounded man to his feet, and the three of them backed out of the barn, disappearing into the deepening twilight. The hoofbeats faded into the hills, leaving only the quiet hum of evening and the smell of smoke and fear. Elias lowered his rifle and turned to Maribel, who was still standing close, her hands steady despite the tremor in her breath. Hope stepped forward, her small hand curling into his. For the first time in 3 years, Elias felt the weight of inheritance settle on his shoulders. Not land or debt, but the responsibility to protect what was left of his family. He looked down at Ruth's papers, the ink smudged but legible, a testimony from beyond the grave. She wasn't just fighting for herself, Elias murmured. She was fighting for a future she'd never see, for a little girl who deserved to grow up free. As the last light of day slipped behind the hills, Elias Boone understood that his exile was over. He could no longer hide from the world or from the blood that tied him to it. Isolation had been his armor, but family would have to be his strength now. The prairie was quiet except for the wind. It bent the tall grass in gentle waves, carrying the scent of dust and distant sage. The sun bled gold across the horizon, stretching long shadows from the old barn to the porch where Elias Boone now sat. The world felt different, warmer, alive, though nothing had changed except the people around him. Hope Quinn crouched in the yard, her small hands brushing the flank of Elias's horse. The animal snorted softly and leaned into her touch. Hope laughed, a sound that was light, clear, and so foreign to this place that it felt like the land itself was listening. Maribel and the other Quinn women moved about the yard with quiet purpose, stacking firewood, sweeping the porch, and carrying milk from the barn. The homestead, silent for 3 years, now hummed with life again. Elias watched them and felt a weight lift from his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't counting the minutes until the day ended. He wasn't waiting for darkness to hide him from his regrets. Instead, he let himself feel the fragile, simple joy of being part of something bigger than himself. He leaned against the porch railing, eyes on the endless sweep of land that had once felt like a prison. His voice came low, carrying the weight of a lesson hard learned. "I thought walls and distance would keep me safe, but safety isn't living. Real strength is opening your door when the world comes knocking and choosing to belong again." The words hung in the air as the sky deepened from gold to a soft lavender dusk. The barn cats prowled between the hay bales. Agnes Doyle hummed an old hymn as she hung a lantern by the door. Life, after years of silence, had returned to Elias's world. Days turned into weeks, and the Boone homestead transformed. The fences were mended, the cows were healthy again, and laughter echoed off the weathered boards of the barn. At night, Elias would sit by the fire with Hope at his side, listening to her speak about Ruth, about the mother he had abandoned but would never forget. Sometimes the stories hurt, but the hurt was different now. It was healing, not hollowing. News traveled slowly across the prairie, and it would be some time before Elias knew if Silas Granger truly meant his threat of revenge. But the fear that had ruled his life for years was gone. He was no longer hiding. He was living and ready to defend the fragile family he had rediscovered. As the camera of imagination pulls back, the scene widens to show the prairie under a burning sunset, the small figure of Hope Quinn leading the horse toward the barn, and Elias Boone standing on the porch like a man reborn. His voice drifts into a reflective tone, speaking not just to himself, but to anyone listening. Family doesn't always knock twice, and the time we lose hiding from our past is time we never get back. In the end, what matters most isn't how far we can run from pain, but how brave we are when we turn back toward the people who need us. I waited too long to learn that lesson. Don't make my mistake. This story, though set in the rugged past of the American frontier, carries lessons that still speak to life today. In a world where it's easy to shut ourselves off behind screens, closed doors, or unspoken grudges, Elias Boone's journey is a reminder that isolation feels safe, but connection makes us human. Maybe you've felt that weight too, Moments where pride or hurt made you stay away from the people you love. Maybe there's a phone call you haven't made, a visit you've avoided, a family bond you've let go cold. Stories like this one challenge us to step out from behind our walls before it's too late. Before the night fully settles, Elias looks toward the horizon, where the sun has almost disappeared. He knows the world is uncertain. He knows trouble could return. But tonight, he is not alone. And for the first time, that is enough. And now I turn to you, the listener. Have you ever chosen distance over connection? Do you believe people can truly change after years of isolation? What would you have done in Elias Boone's place? Fight, run, or forgive? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories, your lessons, your reflections, they're what keep this community alive. If this story touched you, consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that family, in all its messy and complicated ways, is worth holding on to. Thank you for spending this time with us under the wide western sky. Until the next story, stay safe, stay strong, and never forget the power of coming home.